Today, I want to tell you a story so intense it asks a brutal question. How far will people go when fear outweighs conscience? It takes place in the Old West, where cracked earth, dying rivers, and collapsing dreams turned hope into desperation. And it all started with something that seemed harmless at first, a rumor, yet it was enough to set fate, blood, and justice on a collision course. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The storm rolled in across the prairie like the fury of a vengeful god. Lightning tore through the purple-black sky, exposing the horror below in savage bursts, while thunder crushed the open plains, swallowing every sound except the sharpest screams. "Please, don't do this to me!" the girl cried, her voice splintering with terror, almost lost in the screaming wind. "I haven't done anything wrong, please!" she begged. She was no more than 16 years old. Her wrists were bound tight behind her back with coarse hemp rope, and her calico dress, once blue, now washed to a lifeless gray, clung to her skin, heavy with rain. Mud coated her bare feet as they dragged her across the soaked ground. Her auburn hair, usually kept braided as expected of an orphan working for her keep, now hung loose and plastered across her face. The crowd hemming her in ignored every plea. There were more than 30 of them, forming a rough circle atop Cemetery Hill. Their faces were twisted not by the storm, but by fear and desperation. Farmers whose fields had died under endless drought. Shopkeepers ruined when the silver mine shut down. Mothers watching their children grow thin with hunger. Desperation had bound them together. "The drought has lasted 2 years," shouted Malachi Bray, his black coat snapping in the wind like a scavenger's wings. He raised a battered Bible overhead, though its pages flailed uselessly. 2 years since the Lord blessed this land with rain. 2 years of punishment for the evil we harbor among us. The crowd answered with a low murmur, heavy as distant thunder. A crude wooden post stood at the center of the circle, and it was there they had tied Lorna Kester. She strained against the ropes until blood ran from her wrists, but the knots did not give. "She's cursed!" screamed Edith Kellen, her eyes wild. "Ever since she came here, nothing but ruin. First the mine, then the drought." "I'm just an orphan," Lorna sobbed. "I washed dishes at the hotel. I never hurt anyone." Malachi Bray stepped closer, his boots sinking into the mud. Up close, Lorna saw it clearly. There was no holy light in his eyes, only cold calculation. He leaned near enough that she could smell whiskey on his breath despite the rain. "The Lord demands a sacrifice," he said, loud for the crowd, but aimed squarely at her. "Blood for rain, that is what will save this town." A new voice cut through the chaos, deep and steady. "The old ways teach no such thing." The mob turned as one. From the storm stepped a tall, lean Apache warrior. Rain streamed from his long black hair. He wore buckskins despite the weather and moved with the quiet balance of a man raised on horseback. A rifle rested easily in his hands, though he did not raise it. "Jack," someone whispered, and the name rippled through the crowd. The warrior's eyes were dark, worn by grief. The deaths of his wife and child, claimed by sickness brought by settlers the winter before, had carved hard lines into his face. Though he was not yet 30, he spoke with the weight of generations. "You speak of old ways, holy man," Jacques said calmly. "My people lived on this land long before your grandfathers were born. We have endured many droughts. Never once did we spill innocent blood to call the rain." Malachi Bray's face burned red. "Go back to your reservation, heathen. This is a matter for Christian folk." "Christian?" Jacques asked quietly. "I have read your book. Your Christ spoke of mercy, of protecting the innocent. Where's that teaching now? Edric Halden, the deputy, shifted uneasily, his hand brushing his holster. He was a thin man, worn hollow by debt and compromise. Now listen, Jacques, you'd best move along. This doesn't concern you. When men prepare to murder a child for rain, Jacques replied, it concerns everyone. The word murder rippled through the crowd. Some of the Dustfall settlers hesitated, eyes flicking between the bound girl and the preacher. It's not murder, Malachi Bray snapped. It's divine justice. The girl is tainted. Her mother was a witch. Everyone knows bad blood breeds bad blood. My mother was a schoolteacher, Lorna cried. She died of fever when I was 8. How is that witchcraft? But reason had already drowned. Hunger and fear had poisoned their minds. They needed someone to blame, and a friendless orphan was the easiest target. Jacques stepped forward. Several men lifted their weapons. You would threaten me for speaking the truth? He asked. Look at yourselves. You came west seeking freedom and promise. Now you cower like frightened animals, ready to kill a child. She's not one of us, a blacksmith snarled. She's nobody. No, Jacques said firmly. She is innocent. The wind howled harder, the storm pressing down as if the land itself were listening. The blacksmith, someone snarled. His forge has been cold for months. She's nobody. No family, no ties. If the Lord wants a sacrifice. The Lord wants no such thing, Jacques cut in sharply. But there are men who profit from your fear. Men who drip poison into your ears while counting what they stand to gain. His eyes locked on Malachi Bray. Something unspoken passed between them. This was never just about drought or superstition. Thunder split the sky, close enough to rattle bone. In that heartbeat of chaos, Jacques moved. Fast as a striking animal, he charged the post where Lorna Kester was bound. Edric Halden fumbled for his revolver, too slow. Stop him! Malachi Bray shouted. But the storm broke wide open. Rain came down hard, not the blessing they begged for, but a savage flood that turned the hilltop into churning mud. Men slipped and swore, blinded by sheets of water. Jacques reached Lorna and cut her ropes clean, a knife flashing into his hand like it had always been there. She sagged into him, legs shaking. Can you run? He asked, urgent. She nodded, unsure. Then stay close. They vanished into the storm together, the Iron Ridge Apache warrior and the orphan girl, while rage exploded behind them. Gunshots cracked, but rain and darkness ruined every aim. At the center of the chaos, Malachi Bray stood soaked through, gray hair plastered to his skull. His scheme was unraveling, yet his face showed no fear, only calculation. He turned to Edric Halden, struggling to rally a pursuit. Find them, he ordered. The girl especially. She matters more than these fools know. Reverend, maybe we should... Find them, Bray repeated, his voice sharp. Or would you like certain people in Denver to hear about your debts? About how you've been paying them? Halden went pale. He nodded and began barking orders to the scattered Dustfall settlers. Down the hillside, Jacques and Lorna ran, sliding through mud toward the creek at town's edge. Her bare feet skidded on slick ground, but each time she faltered, his grip held her steady. They reached the creek as lightning lit the land. Water that once barely covered ankles now surged at knee-height, thick with branches and debris. We have to cross, Jacques said. They'll bring dogs. Lorna stared at the black water, terror rising with the shouts behind them. She nodded. They plunged in. The cold stole her breath as the current clawed at her legs, trying to drag her away. She slipped, but Jacques did not. Step by step, he pulled her through. On the far bank, they collapsed, gasping. Lorna shook uncontrollably, from cold, from fear, from the shock of being alive. Why? She whispered. Why save me? Jacques studied her, voice low. I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. My wife, my daughter. His words faltered. I couldn't save them from the sickness your people brought, but I can save you from the madness they created. Torches flared on the opposite bank. The mob had found the trail. Come, Jacques said, standing. The night's long, and we've got far to go. As they disappeared into the wind-torn prairie, Lorna looked back one last time at the town she'd called home for 8 years. Dustfall, they'd named it. Once full of promise, now just another frontier town rotting under greed and fear. Yet what frightened her most wasn't the mob. It was what she'd seen in Malachi Bray's eyes. He hadn't looked defeated when she was freed. He'd looked like a man whose true plan was only beginning. By morning, Dustfall lay baking beneath a merciless sun. Main Street, once alive with miners and merchants, stretched empty except for wandering dust devils. Paint peeled from buildings like diseased skin. The Grand Hotel's windows stared out, blind and boarded, over a town already halfway dead. Even the saloon, the last flicker of frontier optimism, now opened only 3 nights a week. Edric Holden stood on the jailhouse porch, watching tumbleweeds scrape along Main Street. His badge felt heavier by the day, burdened with compromises and debts that gnawed at him like starving rats. It was the morning after the failed sacrifice. Malachi Bray's words still rang in his skull. Deputy. The voice made him flinch. Bray stepped out from the narrow gap between buildings. Despite the blazing noon sun, the man had a way of appearing without warning, like a spider sensing movement on its web. He wore his usual black coat, heat be damned, and his gray eyes carried the cold focus of a snake measuring its prey. Reverend, Holden said, his mouth dry, have you found them? The trail went cold at Skeleton Creek. That Apache, Jacques, he knows the land too well. Bray's thin lips tightened. That Apache has interfered with God's will, and you allowed it. Now hold on. No, Deputy, you listen. Bray stepped closer. Holden caught a smell that wasn't quite cologne, and wasn't quite rot. Let me refresh your memory. You owe Vorn Kellen $600, a debt no deputy's wages could ever settle. And yet, it hasn't been called in. Holden's hand drifted toward his gun, then fell away. They both knew he wouldn't draw. What do you want? What I've always wanted, Bray said softly. Progress. Prosperity. He stared down Main Street as if seeing a different town rise from the dust. The railroad needs water rights to push its line through this region, and the Kester land sits on the last dependable water source for 50 miles. Holden stiffened. You mean Morella Kester's place? She died years ago. Bray smiled thinly. And now you see it, the girl. Lorna. At last. Yes, Lorna Kester is Morella's daughter, sole heir to 40 acres of prime riverside ground. But she doesn't even know. Of course she doesn't. She was 8 when her mother died. The property's been buried in territorial filings ever since. Bray spread his hands. But once the girl is gone, tragically killed in a drought-crazed riot, the land returns to the town, and the town council, guided by its spiritual shepherd, sells it to the railroad. Holden felt sick. That's why you stirred up talk of sacrifice. Bray's voice sharpened. The drought bred fear. Fear provided cover. If fools needed blood to justify their actions, so be it. The rain came anyway. A fortunate coincidence. Though I doubt it will last. He adjusted his coat. The Southwestern Railroad won't let one girl and one Apache ruin their investment. They've sent their man, Vorn Kellen himself. He arrives tomorrow with a dozen black spur men. Holden pictured Lorna's face. The terror. The way she'd begged. She'd scrubbed dishes at the Grand Hotel for years. Quiet, polite, just trying to live. Find her before Kellen does, Bray said. Dead is preferable. Missing will suffice. Do this, and your debts disappear. He didn't bother finishing the alternative. When Bray was gone, Holden stood alone in the suffocating heat. Down the street, old Martha Perkins swept her storefront with dull persistence, though no customers would come. Somewhere beyond town, a crow cried, harsh and familiar, the frontier's constant omen. North of Dustfall, in the baked hills, another story unfolded. The Whispering Rocks had sheltered travelers long before white men claimed the land. Now they hid two fugitives, still streaked with mud from the storm. Jacques crouched at the mouth of the rocks, eyes fixed on the horizon. Lorna huddled against the cool stone, dress torn, feet raw and bleeding. "Why do they want to kill me?" she asked at last, breaking the silence that had stretched since nightfall. Jacques didn't turn. "Fear makes people dangerous. Desperation makes them cruel." "But Malaki Bray always spoke kindly to me," she said softly. "He said I reminded him of his dead daughter." Lorna hugged her knees tighter. Men like him don't have daughters, only chances to take. Everything she thought she knew about Dustfall, about the people who'd barely tolerated her, was falling apart like the town itself. She needed to speak, to anchor herself to something ordinary. "Your English is very good," she said. "The mission school," Jacques replied, old bitterness roughening his voice. "They said learning white ways would help my people. What it taught me was how your people think when they want our land." "I'm sorry," Lorna said quickly. "You didn't steal anything." "No," he said. "But—" He stopped, searching for words. "My mother taught at the Indian school," Lorna went on. "Before I was born, she said it was wrong, taking children from their families. She quit when she married my father." Jacques finally turned, studying her with those dark, weary eyes. "Mirella Kester was your mother. You knew her?" "She taught my sister," he said. "One of the few whites who saw us as people, not problems." He paused. "Your mother owned land by the river. Good land." "We lived in town," Lorna said. "I don't remember any land." "What do you remember of her death?" She closed her eyes. "Fever. Oswin Marrow said there was nothing he could do. After that, Edith Kellen took me in as kitchen help, said it was Christian charity." "The same woman who called for your blood last night," Jacques said. The irony hung between them. A dust plume on the horizon caught his attention. "Riders! Fast! We need to move!" They slipped from the rocks like ghosts, climbing higher into rough country. Behind them, the search party thundered past, Edric Holden at the front, driving men whose bloodlust hadn't cooled with daylight. As they climbed, Dustfall shrank below them, a dying thing bleeding people in hope. The abandoned silver mine yawned like a wound in the mountainside. The cemetery's white markers spread like broken teeth, and through it all, the river, reduced to a trickle, kept flowing past Mirella Kester's forgotten 40 acres. Back in town, Malachi Bray stood in his austere office behind the church, speaking with a man who wouldn't officially arrive until tomorrow. Vorn Kellen of the Southwestern Railroad's security arm had ridden ahead, eager to assess the damage. "My aunt says you've had complications," Kellen said. He was everything Edith wasn't. Lean, cold, efficient. Twin colts rode his hips. His eyes held the flat calm of a man who killed for pay and slept through setbacks. "The girl will be found," Bray assured him. "She'd better be." Kellen's voice was businesslike. "The company has contracts. That spur line needs water. The board won't tolerate delays." "You'll have your water rights." Kellen lit a cigar. "I brought 12 good men, former soldiers, Indian fighters. We'll scour every rock and crevice for your orphan. And the Apache?" He shrugged. "They die out here all the time." Bray smiled thinly. "God works in mysterious ways." "God has nothing to do with it," Kellen said, standing. "This is business." He paused. "One thing. Why all the theater? Why not forge the deed?" "Because," Bray replied, "even in a dying town, some cling to inconvenient principles. Caldwell Roan, for example, former mining clerk, keeps meticulous records, copies of everything, including, I suspect, Morella Kester's original will." "Then kill him too, and risk those papers already being shared?" Bray shook his head. "No. Better to let tragedy run its course. A drought-maddened mob, a necessary sacrifice, an unfortunate death, clean, legal, unquestioned." Kellen shrugged. Results mattered. Methods didn't. After he left, Bray returned to his desk and opened a leather-bound ledger hidden in a false drawer. Columns of figures stared back. Bribes paid, officials bought, promises tallied. The railroad had sunk thousands into this plan. They would have their water, their spur line, their profits. And if a few people had to die for progress, well, that was civilization's price. Outside, the sun traced its merciless arc across a cloudless sky. Far off, a lone eagle circled on rising air, a witness to the land's long remembering. The reservations swelled while the mines burrowed deeper, fouling creeks and leaving sickness behind. Now men were hunting a girl whose only sin was standing between powerful interests and their gold. The West was changing. The frontier was closing. And in places like Dustfall, the old habits of taking what you wanted wore new disguises: paper instead of pistols, corporations instead of conquest. Still, once in a while, someone refused. Sometimes it was an Iron Ridge Apache warrior carrying the grief of his people. Sometimes it was an orphan who hadn't yet learned her own value. And sometimes, in the hard arithmetic of the frontier, that was enough to tilt the scale. The chase began at dawn. Jacques had hoped for more time, but the baying of dogs rolled through the canyon, telling him the trail was found. Beside him, Lorna Kester fought to keep pace, her torn dress snagging on thorns, her bleeding feet leaving faint marks on stone. "How many?" she gasped. "Too many," he said. He lifted her over a fallen log. Numbers mattered less in broken country. They were dropping now toward the river. The San Miguel ran low this season, but its twisting course promised cover and would muddle the dogs. Voices bounced off canyon walls behind them. Edric Holden's reluctant shouts tangled with harsher orders from men Jacques didn't know. "The girl's worth 500. Vorn Kellen's voice carried clean. "Alive or dead. There's a bonus if she's breathing." Lorna stumbled, fear stealing her balance. 500, she whispered. "I've never seen $20 in my life." "Your life is worth more than they understand," Jacques said quietly. "Move." They reached the bank as the sun climbed. The water ran rust-red with minerals, barely knee-deep but fast. Without pausing, Jacques led them in, angling upstream against the current. The cold shocked Lorna to the bone. She bit back a cry. Every sound could give them away. They waited, counting heartbeats, until Jacques found what he was looking for, a sharp bend where centuries of floods had carved a hollow beneath the bank. He eased her into the shadow. "Stay," he whispered. "Don't move until I come back." "Where are you going?" "To give them something to chase." He pressed his knife into her hand. "If anyone finds you who isn't me, use this." "I don't know how." "You'll learn." His dark eyes held hers. "Your mother had courage. Find yours." Then he was gone. He made noise on purpose downstream. Lorna flattened herself against the cold earth, clutching the knife, her heart pounding louder than the river. Jacques let them glimpse him, a flicker on the far bank. Gunfire cracked. Bullets sparked off stone. He smiled without humor. White men always wasted lead on shadows. He pulled them east, away from Lorna, laying false trails, doubling back, slipping through rock where no print remained. The Black Spur men were capable, but they were plains fighters, not mountain men. In the maze of canyons and arroyos, Jacques became a rumor. Edric Holden stopped while Kellen's men chased ghosts. He thought. The Apache was leading them away from something, or someone. Holden turned back, reading the ground with practiced eyes. He'd tracked outlaws for 10 years. There, a small print in wet mud, too small for a man. He followed it to the river, then upstream, letting the signs speak. When he found the hollow beneath the bank, Lorna was ready. She lunged, wild and desperate. Holden caught her wrist easily but gently. "Easy," he whispered. "Easy." "I'm not letting you hurt me," she hissed, fighting him. "You were there. You let them tie me." "I know," he said, anguish creasing his face. "God help me. I know." He loosened his grip but didn't let go. "I can't let them kill you. Not for him. Not for money." Something in Edric Holden's voice made Lorna Kester stop struggling. "Then let me go," she said. "I can't do that either. Kellen's men will shoot me the moment they see me, and Malachi Bray, he's rattled. You don't know what he's capable of." "Then what?" she demanded. Holden made a choice that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I'm taking you in. Alive, in public. Too many eyes for them to kill you outright. It might buy us time." "They'll find another way," she said quietly. "Maybe, but it's better than a bullet in your back out here." He helped her from the hollow, feeling how light she was. Underfed, worked down to bone. Just a child. "Can you walk?" She nodded, drained. The fight had bled out of her with the realization that even mercy came twisted in this land. They hadn't gone 50 yards when Jacques appeared on the rocks above them, rifle leveled at Holden's chest. "Let her go." Holden didn't reach for his gun. "You know I can't." "Then you die." "Maybe," Holden said evenly. "But Kellen's men will hear the shot. They'll be here in minutes. You might get away. Will she?" It was the Frontier's cruel math. Jacques could kill Holden, but the sound would doom them. Holden could shout for help, but Jacques would drop him first. "Don't," Lorna said, stepping between them, small, fierce, spent. "He's trying to help, I think." "There is no help from men like him," Jacques said. "Please," she said, "I won't have anyone else die for me, not even him." Jacques' finger tightened. Holden stood still, accepting whatever came. Seconds stretched thin. From downstream, a shout, "Tracks this way!" The Black Spur men were closing. "Go!" Holden hissed to Jacques. "Get out. I'll tell them you doubled back into the mountains." "Why?" Jacques' rifle never wavered. "Because maybe," Holden said, his voice breaking, "I'm done being the kind of man who lets children die for money. My sister, back in Kansas, she was about your age when fever took her. I couldn't save her. Maybe—" "Deputy Holden," Vorn Kellen's voice cut closer. "Report." Jacques made his choice. He lowered the rifle, met Lorna's eyes. "Be strong. This isn't finished." Then he was gone, smoke in stone, leaving Holden and Lorna as mercenaries crashed through brush. Kellen arrived flushed and furious. "The Apache?" "Headed back to the mountains," Holden lied smoothly. "Found the girl hiding. Figured bringing her in alive was worth more than chasing shadows." "Smart." Kellen studied Lorna with flat appraisal. "Doesn't look like much. Hard to believe she's worth the trouble." "Please," Lorna said. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" "Your signature," Kellen said. "Or your death. Either works." He turned. "Tie her. Gag her if she makes noise. We're heading back." As rough hands bound her again, Lorna caught Halden's eye. He looked away, but not before she saw the shame burning there. He'd saved her from dying fast. For what? A colder game. The ride back to Dustfall took 3 hours. Lorna was slung across a saddle like cargo, ribs aching with every jolt. Around her, the mercenaries spoke easily of past work. Raids crushed, strikes broken, obstacles removed. Violence was their trade. Business was good. They entered town at high sun. Word spread. People spilled from doorways like insects from cracks. Some of the same faces that had howled for her blood now watched in silence, perhaps wondering what they'd nearly done. Malaki Bray waited at the jail, immaculate despite the heat. He smiled thinly. "Miss Kester," he said, "so good to see you safe." She spat at Vorn Kellen's boots. He answered with a casual backhand, splitting her lip. "Manners?" Malaki Bray scolded mildly. "Take her inside. We have papers to review." As they hauled Lorna Kester into the jail, she caught a flicker of movement in the second-story window of the old mining office. A curtain shifted. Caldwell Roan, the reclusive former clerk, was watching. Watching, and in his careful way, recording. The cell door slammed with the weight of a coffin lid. Through the bars, Lorna could see the cemetery on the hill where her mother lay. Who owned land worth killing for? Who died conveniently when that land became valuable? "Mama," she whispered to the empty cell. "What do I do now?" Outside, a crow called once and went quiet. The afternoon heat pressed down on Dustfall like a sentence. Somewhere in the mountains, an Iron Ridge Apache warrior measured his next move in a game where stakes were counted in blood and acres. In the jail's front office, Edric Halden tried not to hear Lorna's soft sobs. He might have saved her life. But at what cost? Kellen cleaned his pistols with methodical care, whistling. Bray studied documents with a banker's focus. And through it all, the river slid past 40 acres of prime land, carrying away dusted dreams and the ash of integrity, running rust-red toward a future built on bones. The knock came at midnight. Soft, insistent. Caldwell Roan set down his pen and approached his door with the caution of a man who knew what happened to those who knew too much. Through the peephole, a familiar silhouette cut the moonlight. "I know you're in there," Jacques said, his voice low and urgent. "The girl needs your help." Roan hesitated. He'd spent 8 years keeping his head down, filing papers, avoiding notice. But Morella Kester's daughter sat in a cell tonight, and some debts outweighed fear. He opened the door. Jacques slipped inside, followed by an unexpected companion. Edric Halden, hollow-eyed and conflicted. "This is a mistake," Halden muttered. "If Kellen finds out," Roan said, already moving, "we work faster." He led them into his study, filing cabinets lining every wall. "You're here about the Kester land," Jacques said. "I know everything in this town worth documenting," Roan replied. He opened a drawer with precise care. "Morella Kester was my friend. One of the few who treated me with respect when I was a mine clerk, with bad lungs and worse prospects." He laid out a folder reverently. She knew she was dying. Fever was only the last act. She'd been poisoned, slowly, for months. Mercury in her well. Not enough to kill quickly, just enough to weaken her. Halden swore under his breath. "Who?" "The mine was failing. Railroad surveys had begun," Roan said, adjusting his spectacles. "Smart men were buying water rights. Morella refused to sell. She wanted that land preserved." "Malaki Bray," Jacques said. It wasn't a question. "Among others," Roan nodded. "The Southwestern Railroad has many investors. Hollis Barrow, Darius Fenwick, even Oswin Merrow, who certified the death. He drew another document. But here's what they don't know I have. Morella's original will, properly witnessed, filed with the territorial capital. Halden's eyes widened. Lorna inherits everything at 18. In 2 years, Roan said. That's why they need her dead. Or married, Halden added. A husband would control— No, Roan said, thin smile forming. Morella was smarter than that. He tapped a clause. If Lorna marries before 18, the land goes into trust until she's 21. If she dies before inheriting, the land transfers to the Iron Ridge Apache for education. Jacques straightened. All of it. Every acre, Roan said. Water rights included. She believed your people were cheated. She wanted to make amends. He gathered more papers. I have copies of everything. Railroad correspondence, bribe receipts, Bray's letters discussing the removal of obstacles. This could ruin them. If it reaches the right hands, Halden breathed, the territorial governor, or the territory marshals. Roan met his gaze. First, we get Lorna out of that cell alive. Vorn Kellen keeps 2 men posted at the jail. The rest of his Black Spur men are camped beyond the edge of town. Edric Halden dragged a hand down his face. And Malachi Bray has called a town gathering for tomorrow. He plans to put her on trial. Witchcraft. Blaming her for the drought. Any madness that might stick. Kellen would see to a guilty verdict. Frontier justice moved fast. A trial, Jacques said slowly, with the whole town watching. A public trial means public proof. The warrior's eyes shifted to Caldwell Roan. Can you move those papers to the right hands while everyone's distracted? If I have cover, yes, Roan answered. But Bray controls the story. He'll plant witnesses, forge evidence. Then we give him what he doesn't expect. Jacques turned to Halden. You arrest me tonight. Halden stiffened. Bring you in as her accomplice? That's suicide. Kellen will shoot you the moment you try to run. Not if you make it loud, Jacques said calmly. Not if the whole town knows you've captured the savage who helped her. His smile cut thin. They want a spectacle. We'll give them one they won't forget. Roan cleared his throat. There's something else. Morella left another item. He retrieved a small wooden box. Inside lay a locket and a sealed letter. She made me swear to give these to Lorna on her 16th birthday. That was 3 months ago. What's in the letter? Halden asked. I never opened it, Roan said, but Morella told me it held the truth that would set her daughter free. They planned for an hour. Roan would send trusted copies of the evidence to Fort Laramie. Halden would arrest Jacques publicly at first light. And during the confusion of the trial, somehow, Morella's letter would reach Lorna. It was a fragile plan, full of gaps. But on the frontier, fragile plans were often all you had. As Jacques turned to leave, Roan stopped him. Why risk your life for a white girl? Your people have suffered enough. The warrior's eyes carried a quiet grief. Hate is a circle. Someone has to break it. My daughter would be Lorna's age now. Perhaps saving one child honors another. Halden walked Jacques to the edge of town, where they staged a convincing arrest. The deputy's raised voice drew witnesses, ensuring the story would spread before dawn. By sunrise, every Dustfall settler would know the infamous Jacques sat in irons beside the girl. Lorna woke to noise. Through the bars, she saw them bring Jacques in. Their eyes met across the dust-choked street. He gave the slightest nod. She didn't know the plan, but she knew the meaning. Be ready. Malachi Bray received the news with pleasure, barely masking irritation. Both of them. Convenient, though I'd have preferred the Indian dead. Hard to explain a corpse with this many eyes, Kellen replied. This is cleaner. We try them together. The girl corrupted by the savage. The town will demand justice. Justice, Bray repeated, savoring the word. Yes, tomorrow. He didn't notice the shadow at his window. Roan moving through the night like a ghost, passing envelopes to carefully chosen hands. The newspaper editor fired for asking questions. The schoolteacher whose husband died in a suspicious mine collapse. The shopkeeper cheated out of his claim. One by one, seeds of truth were pressed into soil rich with grievance. Back in the abandoned mine office, Roan lit his lamp and began writing one final statement, his own testimony. He knew the danger. Men who challenged power vanished. But Marella Kester had shown him kindness when kindness was scarce. Her daughter deserved more than an unmarked grave. As he wrote, he remembered Morella's words from years past. Truth is like water, Caldwell. Bury it deep enough, and it still finds a way through. From his window, he could see the jail where two innocent souls waited for a sham of justice. Beyond it, the river slid past 40 acres already paid for in lives. Perhaps, just perhaps, truth would run faster than blood. Above, desert stars wheeled, indifferent to human schemes. In a few hours, the sun would rise on what might be Dustfall's last day living comfortably with its lies. The vultures were already gathering, some with feathers, some with law books, each sensing that death was coming, and that it would feed them well. Lorna Kester clutched her mother's Bible, whispering half-remembered prayers. In the cell across from her, Jacques sang softly in the tongue of the Iron Ridge Apache, a warrior's song his grandfather had taught him. Across the dying town, people tossed in uneasy sleep, knowing dawn would bring a reckoning. Caldwell Roan sealed the final envelope as first light brushed the eastern sky. Everything was set. The evidence was scattered where it needed to be. The truth was loaded and ready. Now it only needed someone, anyone in Dustfall, to remember what justice was supposed to look like. He thought of Marella Kester, dead these 8 years, and murmured, "We're trying, Marella. God help us. We're trying." Outside, a rooster crowed, announcing a day that would decide whether a town built on dreams of prosperity would finally face the nightmare it had made. The trial had barely begun when the first blast rocked Dustfall. The old mine shaft on Cemetery Hill burst into flame and smoke, debris raining down on the makeshift courthouse. In the confusion, Roan slipped through the crowd, pressing packets into chosen hands before melting away. "Railroad demolition crews," Vorn Kellen snarled, recognizing professional work. "Someone's destroying the mineral survey records." Malachi Bray held his composure from the bench, Hollis Barrow conspicuously absent. "A distraction won't save the accused. Proceed." But the explosions did more than erase records. They tore open old tunnels connecting to newer digs, passages certain men had used 8 years earlier to feed mercury and other poisons into Marella Kester's well. As proceedings lurched on, a second blast echoed from Skeleton Ridge. Kellen's men scattered, torn between guarding prisoners and chasing fires. "The Indians are attacking!" someone shouted. It wasn't true, but fear raced through the packed room. Lorna stood in chains beside Jacques, watching the carefully staged justice begin to unravel. Edric Halden shifted, his hand never leaving his gun. That was when Rowan made his move, slipping close enough to press a folded letter into Lorna's bound hands. Their eyes met for a heartbeat before he vanished. "Order!" Bray bellowed. "We will have order!" A third blast thundered, this time from the railroad depot. Kellen cursed and gathered what men he had left. "Watch the prisoners. I'll handle this." As he rushed out, Lorna unfolded her mother's letter, reading fast. "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then Caldwell kept his promise and dark days have found you. First, know that I love you beyond words. Second, know that the man you were told was your father was a story meant to protect you. Your father is Edric Halden." Lorna's world tipped. She looked up. Halden had gone pale as ash. The letter went on. We loved each other, but his family would never accept a schoolteacher's life. When I learned I carried you, Edric was already promised to another. I released him and built a fiction to shield us all. He does not know you are his, though I have watched him watch you and seen the pain in his eyes. He is weak, Lorna, but not cruel. In time, blood may call to blood. The land I leave you was bought with my inheritance. Proof rests in territorial records. They cannot take what was lawfully paid. Trust Caldwell Roan. Trust the truth. And if you can, forgive your father. He learned courage too late. All my love, Mother? Lorna's hands trembled. She looked at Halden, her father, and saw the truth written across his stricken face. He had known. Somehow, he had known. Continue the trial, Bray commanded. But order was slipping away. Reports arrived in fragments. The blasts had exposed hidden chambers packed with mercury and arsenic. Samples preserved from Mirella Kester's old well matched the toxins exactly. Then worse news reached the bench. Riders from Fort Laramie were approaching fast. Territory marshals, drawn by documents that had appeared at dawn. We're leaving, Kellen said when he returned, eyes hard, the ground shifting beneath him. Soot-stained and raging, Vorn Kellen snarled, The trial's finished. Someone dynamited our weapons cache. Half my men are scattered or bleeding. He seized Lorna Kester by the arm. We take the girl. Once we're clear, we force her signature or put her down. Either way, we get paid. No. Edric Halden stepped forward, his voice steady for the first time in years. You're not taking her anywhere. Kellen's hand drifted toward his gun. You choosing sides, Deputy? Think real careful. I've thought careful my whole life, Halden said, moving between Kellen and Lorna. It's brought me nothing but shame. He drew a breath. She's my daughter. The courthouse erupted. The truth rippled through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Malachi Bray's face twisted with fury. This wasn't in his script. Your bastard child, he hissed. Kellen sneered. Changes nothing. A shot cracked from above. Kellen spun and dropped, clutching his shoulder. In the gallery, Irene Velez lowered a smoking pistol, the shopkeeper whose family had been broken under Kellen's work. Hell broke loose. The Black Spur men returned fire. Townsfolk dove for cover. Zajac snapped his chains, already weakened by Caldwell Roan's filed key, and moved like a cutting wind. One mercenary fell to his blade, another to Halden's desperate shot. The tunnels! Roan burst through the smoke. The old mine tunnels, this way! They ran, Lorna, Zac, Halden, and Roan, into the maze beneath dustfall as gunfire and screams chased them. Years of buried rage finally broke loose above. In the dark, they navigated by Roan's memory. He had mapped these passages for years, cataloging the town's hidden sins. There's an exit by the river, he gasped near the old smelter. They burst into daylight to find dustfall in chaos. Territory marshals traded fire with railroad guns. Townspeople had formed a mob, this time hunting their oppressors, not a scapegoat. Bray's church burned, set alight by those who'd finally seen through his false piety. My horse, Jacques said, hidden in the cottonwoods. They reached the trees before Kellen found them, bloodied, unbound, with 3 men at his back. Should have taken the easy way, he growled, lifting his rifle. Halden stepped forward. Lorna, run. I won't, she said. That's an order. From your father. He met her eyes. I never had you, girl. Maybe I can give you something now. He faced Kellen. You want her? Come through me. The gunfight was brief and savage. Halden fought like a man with nothing left to lose, because he was. When the smoke thinned, Kellen and 2 of his men lay dead. Halden slumped against a cottonwood, red spreading across his chest. Lorna fell to her knees beside him, tears streaking the dust. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Your mother was protecting you," he coughed, blood flecking his lips. "From me, from what I was." He pressed something into her hand, his badge. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Should have said it years ago." Edric Halden died as the sun reached its zenith, finally at peace with choices that had haunted him for 16 years. They buried him by the river, on the land Mirella Kester had bought for her daughter. Jacques spoke words of farewell as the territory marshals gathered what remained of Bray's conspiracy. The Reverend was found later in his study, dead by his own hand. The railroad men would face trial. Dustfall would fade, its rotten foundations exposed at last. But by the river there was only grief, and a strange, hard grace. "He was weak," Roan said softly. "But in the end, he was her father." Lorna closed her fingers around the badge. "That has to count for something." An eagle circled overhead, the same witness to cruelty and to reckoning. It had seen justice twisted and justice restored, greed measured in blood. The West was changing. The old ways of taking what you wanted were ending, replaced by law and order. Yet in that violent space between what was and what would be, a line had finally been drawn. Sometimes a weak man found steel in his spine. Sometimes a quiet soul found a voice. And sometimes a forgotten daughter uncovered her inheritance. The river kept moving, washing away the soot of Dustfall's sins, running clear at last toward whatever tomorrow might bring. Ahead, the canyon pinched tight, walls of red stone rising like iron bars against the sky. Behind them, plumes of dust marked the chase. The last of Vorn Kellen's mercenaries rode hard, joined by railroad enforcers who'd come in on the morning train. Back in Dustfall, the territory marshals were stretched thin, and these men, cornered and ruined, had nothing left to lose. "There," Jacques said, pointing. Iron rails leapt the gorge, the Tracehill Bridge. 200 feet of steel spanning Devil's Canyon, an engineering miracle carrying the southwestern line through country that fought every inch. Below, the drop fell away into shadow and broken rock. "That's suicide," Caldwell Roan wheezed, clutching the saddle, the satchels of evidence thumping at his side. "We'll never make it before—" A rifle cracked against the stone, cutting him off. Horses skittered as more rounds sang past. "The train," Lorna Kester said suddenly. "Listen." Far off, a whistle echoed. The 2:15 freight out of Denver, right on time. Jacques' eyes flashed with a hard, desperate idea. "We don't cross the bridge," he said. "We take the train." They drove their exhausted horses toward the oncoming locomotive. The riders behind were close now, close enough for Lorna to see the fury twisted into their faces. Their employer was dead, their plot exposed. Warrants were coming. Only revenge remained. The engine burst into view, black smoke boiling skyward, wheels screaming on iron. The engineer saw the riders and hauled on the brake, but physics demanded time and distance they didn't have. "Jump when I jump!" Jacques shouted over the roar. They ran alongside the slowing freight cars. Terror clawed Lorna's chest, the blur of ground, the bulk of steel threatening to drag her under. But Edric Halden's badge burned in her palm, and her mother's courage rang in her blood. Jacques leapt first, snaring the ladder of a boxcar. He turned, arm outstretched. Lorna gathered herself and jumped, weightless terror. Then his hands caught her, hauling her aboard. Roan followed, barely making it, the evidence bag swinging wild. His horse stumbled, and for a breath she thought he'd vanish beneath the wheels. But the clerk's surprising strength held. He collapsed on the car floor, gasping. Gunfire erupted as the pursuers reached the train. The engineer finally understood and opened the throttle. The freight surged, rolling onto the trestle bridge. The mercenaries didn't quit. Several clambered onto the rear cars, pushing forward. The train became a battlefield in motion, high above the canyon floor. "Stay down," Jacques ordered, moving with lethal calm. The first attacker rounded the gap and met his blade. The second fired, grazing Jacques' shoulder, before being hurled into empty air. More came. Lorna couldn't hide. She thought of Mirella Kester, poisoned for refusing to sell. Of Holden, finding courage at the end. She took the deputy's pistol, her father's gun, and stood. A mercenary appeared at the far end of the car, rifle rising. Lorna fired without thinking. The recoil hammered her hands. The man spun and dropped between the cars, his screams swallowed by the canyon. "Behind you!" Roan shouted. She turned to see Vorn Kellen, impossibly alive, blood-soaked, climbing over the tender. Pain and rage carved his face. His hands were steady. "Should have signed when you had the chance, girl." Time thinned to glass. Kellen's finger tightened. Jacques was too far. Roan was unarmed. Lorna knew, with sudden clarity, she would die on this train, never seeing justice finished. A shot cracked from above. Kellen staggered, staring upward. On the locomotive roof stood a figure in marshal's blue. A woman. Auburn hair snapping in the wind. Sybil Drake, who had tracked the conspiracy for months, had finally caught them. Kellen tried to lift his gun. Lorna didn't wait. Her father's pistol spoke twice. The railroad enforcer pitched backward and vanished between the cars, falling into Devil's Canyon below. The remaining black spur men, seeing their commander cut down by a territory marshal on the train, lost their nerve. Some vaulted back to their horses and fled the way they'd come. Others dropped their rifles and raised empty hands. As the train cleared the trestle and began its long descent toward Fort Laramie, Sybil Drake climbed down from the engine to join them. "Lorna Kester, I presume," she said, holstering her weapon with effortless calm. "Caldwell Roan. And you must be Jacques." Her eyes flicked to the satchels. "I've been reading some very interesting papers about Dustfall. Looks like I arrived at the right moment." "How did you—" Roan started. "Your friend here mailed copies to every federal office in 3 territories," Drake replied with a faint smile. "Smart man." She inspected the evidence bags. "This will be more than enough to dismantle what's left of the railroad's corruption." Lorna slid down against the boxcar wall, the strength finally draining out of her. It was over. Truly over. The people who murdered her mother were dead or in irons. The land was secure. Justice, delayed and denied, had finally shown its face. "What happens now?" she asked. Drake's smile softened. "Now you inherit what's yours. The courts will confirm your claim to the Kester property. The railroad will answer to federal charges. And Dustfall?" She shrugged. "Towns built on rot don't last once the light gets in." "And us?" Roan asked carefully. "We bent a few laws these past days." "I saw citizens defending themselves against a criminal conspiracy," Drake said, eyes twinkling. "Nothing more. My report will be very clear about who broke the law." As the train rolled through the amber afternoon, Lorna stood beside Jacques at the open door, watching the country slide past. His shoulder was bandaged, his posture easy for the first time since she'd met him. "Your people saved my life," she said quietly. "Edric, my father, believed the land should go to your tribe if anything happened to me. Maybe we can do better than that. Share the water. Make sure it helps both our people." Jacques studied her with those deep, steady eyes. "Your mother would be proud. She knew the land belongs to no one. We belong to it." "Will you stay?" she asked. "Help me honor what she wanted?" "For a time," he said. A small smile touched his mouth. until you no longer need me. Though I think you found your strength today." Behind them, Roan dozed with his precious files clutched to his chest. He'd risked everything for the truth, and lived to see it stand. Tomorrow he would testify, his careful ledgers damning an empire built on greed. The sun dipped toward the mountains, painting the sky in rose and gold. Somewhere behind them, Dustfall was learning to live without its lies. The powerful had fallen. The small and overlooked had claimed their patch of earth. And on a train bound for justice, a young woman who had nearly died as an offering sat with her unlikely guardians, free at last to build the future her mother had imagined. The frontier was changing. The old violent customs were giving way to law. But in that narrow space between what was and what would be, courage had mattered more than guns, truth more than gold, and love most of all. The love of a mother for her daughter, of a father for the child he'd never claimed, of strangers who became family. That love proved stronger than all the hate money could buy. The whistles sang across the prairie, announcing a new chapter, and Lorna, no longer an orphan, was ready to write it. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne rose like a fortress beneath the Wyoming sky. Inside, the courtroom overflowed. Reporters from Chicago, railroad executives sweating in stiff collars, and ordinary people who'd traveled days to watch giants fall. Lorna sat in the witness chair, no longer the frightened girl dragged toward Cemetery Hill. She wore a plain black dress that had been her mother's, and her father's badge rested close to her heart. When she spoke, her voice carried, steady and clear. "They poisoned my mother because she refused to sell her land. When that failed, they tried to kill me as a sacrifice, using drought and fear to turn neighbors into a mob. The prosecutor, Brenner Colwyn, guided her through the record. Page by page, Roan's meticulous files mapped a corruption trail from Dustfall's dust to Denver's corridors." "Objection." Thayer Quinn rose, sleek and indignant. "These documents could be forgeries." Elias Northam's voice cut the room. "By whom? The dead reverend? The deceased captain?" Counsel would do well to avoid adding frivolous claims to an already heavy docket. The judge was known for his fairness and his contempt for bribery. The railroad had tried and failed. Siebel Drake had seen to that. When Caldwell Roan took the stand, he shed the skin of a timid clerk and became something sharper, an avenging angel armed with ledgers instead of blades. Calmly, relentlessly, he walked the court through every transaction, every payoff, every forged deed. The Southwestern Railroad Company, he testified, while adjusting his spectacles, had deliberately poisoned water sources to force land sales. When intimidation failed, they escalated, stoking hysteria through Malachi Bray, who was promised money and political favor for turning fear into violence. "Lies!" Darius Fenwick shouted from the defense table, the railroad's regional director flushing red. "That girl is nothing but a fortune-hunting orphan." Elias Northam's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "Mr. Fenwick, you will restrain yourself. You'll have your turn. Continue, Mr. Roan." Roan produced a letter in Fenwick's own handwriting, discussing removing the Kester obstacle by any means necessary. The courtroom exploded in noise, barely contained as evidence piled up like snowdrifts in a blizzard. Then Jacques was called. The Apache warrior entered with quiet dignity, ignoring the whispers, the stares. Though his English was fluent, he chose to speak through a translator. He told of watching Dustfall slide into madness, of saving Lorna Kester not as Apache or settler, but because no human should be burned alive to feed another man's greed. "Your Honor," Thayer Quinn tried one last play, rising smoothly. "Surely we cannot accept testimony from a savage." "Mr. Quinn," Judge Northam said coldly, "the only savagery in this courtroom has worn fine coats and spoken of profit. This witness has shown more honor than your clients could purchase with all their gold. Sit down." Zach spoke then of broken promises, poisoned rivers, and land that remembered every crime committed upon it. When he finished, even hardened reporters wiped their eyes. The defense collapsed. Witness after witness recanted. Bribes were admitted. Fear was confessed. Lyric Pale folded under questioning. Edith Kellen, widow of Vorn Kellen, broke completely, confessing her husband's role in exchange for leniency. On the third day, Siebeldrake presented her findings. The conspiracy spanned 7 states, 3 railroad companies, multiple territorial officials, and private enforcers like Kellen. This was not corruption, she concluded. This was organized warfare against citizens who stood in the way of profit. The verdict fell like thunder, guilty on all counts. Railroad executives sat hollow-eyed as sentences were read. Decades in federal prison, fines large enough to collapse companies, restitution orders that would take generations to fulfill. Then came the final moment. "Miss Kester," Judge Northam said, addressing Lorna directly. "This court confirms your full inheritance of the Kester property, including all water and mineral rights. Additionally, given the conspiracy against your life, the court awards punitive damages of $50,000 against the Southwestern Railroad Company." Gasps rippled through the room. Lorna rose slowly. "Your Honor, I have a request." "Proceed." "I don't want the money for myself alone. Dustfall is dying because of what these men did. Good people were driven to desperation. I ask the court to establish a trust, half for rebuilding the town, half for the Iron Ridge Apache, whose lands were taken to build that railroad." Judge Northam's expression softened. "The court finds this request just and fitting, so ordered." The gavel fell for the last time, and the courtroom erupted. Reporters surged forward, already shaping headlines that would shake boardrooms across the nation. The railroad men were led away in chains, their empire reduced to ash. Outside, in the crisp Wyoming air, Lorna stood with her unlikely family, Jacques, Rowan, and Drake. Around them gathered the Dustfall settlers, some crying, some cheering, all changed. "What now?" Rowan asked softly, still clutching his papers as if afraid the truth might vanish. "Now we go home," Lorna said, surprising herself with the word. "We rebuild." "And we build bridges," Zach added quietly, "between people who have been enemies too long." Siebeldrake tipped her hat. "I'll be watching. Washington wants this to work. Dustfall might become proof that justice can replace corruption." As they turned to leave, an elderly Apache woman approached. She spoke quickly to Jacques, her voice trembling. He translated, emotion tightening his throat. "She knew your mother. Mirella Kester taught her grandchildren, treated them as people when others would not. She says your mother's spirit can rest now." That night, in a quiet Cheyenne hotel room, Lorna Kester finally allowed herself to cry, not from fear, not from grief, but from the overwhelming weight of victory, earned not alone, but alongside those who chose justice over safety, truth over profit, and courage over silence. She drew out her mother's locket and her father's badge, pressing both to her chest. Mirella Kester and Edric Halden, imperfect people who had loved deeply, if unevenly. Their daughter would honor them not with words, but by building something better in their names. Tomorrow she would return to Dustfall. There would be obstacles ahead, mending trust, sharing water, healing wounds carved across generations. But tonight, she was simply a young woman who had been tested in the furnace of injustice and had not broken. The West was changing. The era of taking what you wanted at gunpoint was fading, replaced by something harder, slower, and far more hopeful. And at the heart of that change stood a girl who refused to be sacrificed, a warrior who chose compassion over revenge, a clerk who turned truth into a weapon, and a marshal who enforced the law no matter who stood accused. Justice, delayed for so long, had finally rolled like water. And in its wake, something new began to grow, fragile and necessary, yet impossible to stop. 5 years passed after the trial that rattled the frontier. A steel bridge spanning the San Miguel River bore a modest bronze plaque, Halden Crossing, honoring those who had found courage when it mattered. Below it, the river ran clear and strong, nourishing both New Dustfall and the Iron Ridge Apache settlement that had grown beside it. Lorna Kester stood on the bridge. No longer the terrified girl dragged toward Cemetery Hill, but a woman of 21, auburn hair pinned beneath a practical hat. Sunlight glinted off the badge she wore. Not her father's anymore. Her own. The town council had elected her mayor, the first woman to hold the post. Something unthinkable in the old Dustfall. "The school's ready for inspection," Caldwell Roan called from the riverbank. The former clerk had become the town's legal advocate and historian, his meticulous habits now preserving justice instead of corruption. 12 Apache children and 18 from town enrolled this term. The school was Lorna's proudest achievement, built on the ashes of the old church where Malachi Bray once spread fear. It welcomed every child. Mirella Kester's dream of education without prejudice had finally taken root. "The teacher?" Lorna asked as she walked down to him. "Asha," Roan replied, "Apache and white, educated back east, came home to serve both worlds." "And the clinic?" "Oswin Merrow arrived yesterday from San Francisco, already treating patients." Rowan smiled. Funny how many skilled people want to work in a town known for fairness instead of fear. They walked through New Dustfall's streets, once boarded and hollow, now alive. Shops thrived. The hotel Lorna once scrubbed floors in now employed workers from both communities. The weekly market drew traders from miles around, Anglo, Latino, Apache, doing business side by side. At Town Hall, built where Bray's church once poisoned minds, Jacques waited with the Water Council. The warrior had become a living bridge between peoples, teaching that strength came from cooperation, not dominance. "The irrigation channels are finished," he reported. "Both settlements will have water through any drought. The Denver engineers were impressed. They say our model, sharing the source instead of fighting for it, could work across the territories." Lorna nodded. My mother would have loved this. Through the window, children played by the river, Apache and white together, laughter riding the wind. It hadn't been easy. Old hatred died hard. But slowly, person by person, walls came down. "Mayor Kester?" A young man entered, uneasy. "There's trouble at the mine." Her stomach tightened. The silver mine had been sealed, but a new copper vein had been discovered, and vultures never stayed away long. At the entrance, well-dressed men waited with papers and hired guns. Their leader, a railroad attorney named Rusk Montaigne, smiled thinly. "Miss Kester," he said smoothly, "I represent the Mountain West Mining Consortium. We've purchased the mineral rights from the territorial government." "That's impossible," Roan snapped. "Those rights were part of the court settlement." "Settlements can be appealed," Montaigne replied, producing documents. "Reinterpreted, especially with the right connections." Lorna felt the old fear stir. Would it never end? Men willing to burn everything for profit? "You're probably right," she said calmly. "The papers may be legal. You've likely bribed the right officials." Montaigne's smile widened. "I'm glad you're reasonable." "But you made one mistake," Lorna said, turning to the gunmen. "How many of you have families? Children who need schools? Parents who need doctors?" The men shifted uneasily. "New Dustfall offers real work. Fair pay, dignity, A place in the Redstone Guard? We're building something that serves everyone, not just men like him." "Don't listen to her," Montaigne hissed. "She's right," one gunman muttered. Another lowered his rifle. Jacques stepped forward beside Lorna, calm and unarmed. "You can help protect what grows here," he said, "or keep killing for men who will abandon you the moment you're inconvenient." Silence stretched. Then rifles hit the ground. Montaigne backed away, fury twisting his face. But he was alone now. The river kept flowing, clear and strong, past a town that had learned its lessons the hard way. And standing at its heart was a woman who had once been bound for sacrifice, and had become the steward of something far greater, a future built not on fear, but on shared ground. "What are you being paid to do?" Jacques asked. He stepped out from behind the rocks, flanked by nearly 30 armed men, Iron Ridge Apache warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with the Redstone Guard. The line they formed cut the road clean in half. To raise a gun against your own people for another man's greed. The standoff tightened, breath held on both sides. Then one of Rusk Montaigne's men moved. A weathered veteran named Tor Haskell lowered his rifle. "I fought in the war to end slavery," he said quietly. "Didn't survive Gettysburg just to become a slave to money." He glanced at the others. "She's right. I've got grandkids. I want them growing up someplace with hope." One by one, the hired guns stepped back. Montaigne's face darkened to a furious purple. Outnumbered and outplayed, he spat. "This isn't over. The consortium has resources you can't imagine. We'll drown you in lawsuits, strip your credit, turn the territory against you." "Try it." Zibbeldrake emerged from the crowd, her federal badge catching the light. "I'm sure the Justice Department would be fascinated by your methods. We've been building quite a file on the Mountain West Consortium." Montaigne retreated with what men he had left. Everyone knew he wasn't wrong. It wouldn't truly be over. There would always be another consortium, another scheme, another threat. But as the crowd dispersed, Lorna Kester realized something had shifted. The people hadn't looked to her alone. They had stood together, Anglo and Apache, merchant and farmer, bound by something stronger than fear or greed. That evening, Dustfall celebrated at the Harvest Festival. Apache drums braided with fiddle tunes. Children darted between tables heavy with food from many traditions. Stories passed in several languages, all saying the same thing. We are stronger together than apart. Lorna stepped onto the platform where, 5 years earlier, a mob had screamed for her blood. Now the faces lifted toward her held respect and affection. "My mother believed in education and equality," she began. "My father, flawed as he was, found courage at the end. They died for what they believed." She paused, meeting the eyes of the crowd. "But beliefs only matter if we live them every day. Her people, all of them. New Dustfall isn't perfect. We still have disagreements and old wounds that haven't healed. But we've proven something important. When we choose cooperation over conquest, when we see neighbors instead of enemies, when we share instead of hoard, we don't just survive." She smiled. "We thrive." The applause was warm and real as the celebration rolled on into the night. Later, Lorna walked again to Halden Crossing. Jacques joined her, as she knew he would. "You've done well, Mayor Kester," he said. "Your mother's spirit can rest." "We've done well," she corrected softly. "All of us." They stood in easy silence, watching the river slide through the dark. An owl called, not an omen of death, but a guardian of the night. "What's next?" Jacques asked. "The consortium won't quit. Then we'll face them the way we've faced everything else," Lorna said, touching the badge on her chest, then the locket at her throat. "Together." "My mother wrote that truth is like water," she added. "It always finds a way through. We're that water now." Above them the stars turned. The same stars that had witnessed drought and suffering, murder and redemption. Now they shone on something rarer than gold in the Old West. A community choosing justice over judgment, hope over hatred. Lorna opened her locket one last time, studying the faded photograph within. Marilla Kester gazed back, forever young, forever hopeful. "We found the way, Mama," she whispered. As Lorna returned to the celebration, she didn't notice the figure on the hillside, Caldwell Roan, making his nightly notes for the history he was writing. A history not of conquest, but of cooperation. Not of the mighty falling, but of the meek inheriting their small piece of earth and making it bloom. The West was changing, had changed. And in one small town by a flowing river, the future had already arrived. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice, imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.